Welcome to Behind the Play, a video and podcast product of The Hoop Show that explores the lives of Geelong players past and present, as well as the off-field figures that are keeping Geelong strong. My name is Paul James, and today I have the great pleasure to chat to someone who not only has some fascinating insights, I'm sure, on our beloved Geelong Cats, but also some wonderful insights into a range of other teams, including obviously, some news that you broke overnight about Mason Redman and his news around the Bombers. So, Kel Twomey, welcome aboard.
Nice to be here, Paul, and join the Hoops show. It's always a good time of the year, this time of the year, when things are getting a little bit serious on the field, and then off the field there's obviously a lot of traction as well with what we're doing and talking about. So, looking forward to joining you.
Yeah, there's a bit of spice everywhere. It always keeps things interesting. So certainly your perspective on all things AFL more broadly, but even the Cats is something I'm keen to learn a little bit about tonight. So I guess as we talk, I'd love to rewind to a point prior to your actual involvement within the AFL scene officially, and discuss some of the early days. I guess for you, when did footy come into your life? Was it always there from moment one? Were you kind of born with a footy in your hand? How are things for you as you were growing up?
Yeah, I was a big footy fan. Obviously, I don't make it any secret that I grew up a pretty strong and passionate Bombers supporter. There might be some people who still think I make no secret of being an Essendon supporter, but there's been challenges with being an Essendon supporter over the past couple of decades. But yeah, I grew up an Essendon supporter and went to a lot of training days out at Windy Hill. Used to hang around and get autographs and photos, and get to see the players up close and personal, which was so cool. I remember doing that a lot with Dad. Then went to a lot of footy as well. I used to sit in the members, MCC members, and that was when the old stand before the current stand is there, and a lot of the audience probably will never remember the old stand. It's been nearly 20 years since we've had this great new stand. So where we used to sit was in the MCC right near the press box. And I remember I was thinking that'd be a great gig if you weren't good enough to make it. Clearly, I wasn't anywhere near being good enough to making it at AFL level, as most people are who like footy. But yeah, I went to a lot of games, went to a lot of trainings, and loved watching it every day, every night. So I loved it. And from a pretty early age, I was lucky that at school I knew what I wanted to do from a work perspective as well. So that made it pretty easy to narrow in on.
Yeah, it's pretty good to have that sort of direction nice and early, and I certainly do share some fond memories with you there when it comes to the old MCC stand and some of those old seats, and I guess memories from footy. But I also distinctly remember being there at the G when I think there was that famous night of Warney having to walk out and kind of cool Bay 13 and all those sort of things, and rubbish being thrown everywhere. That was quite a spectacle. I don't know, were you there for that by chance?
I wasn't there for that game, but I did go and see Warney a lot. Warney and Lloydie were my two sporting heroes growing up, and I think everyone in Melbourne loved Warney, and a fair few in Melbourne loved Lloydie too. I imagine I was lucky that there was a period there, it was a pretty golden era to be following both of those teams. It was great. And the MCG for winter and summer was fantastic, and got to see a lot of games. I remember, obviously the 2000 year was fantastic, but I was there the 99 prelim as well, which was a hard one to take, and then the comeback game in 2001. So there's some pretty golden times in that little period.
Yeah, certainly a golden era there, and certainly looked upon very fondly by a lot of Essendon supporters such as yourself and others that I know too that continue to talk about it to this day. Why?
Hasn't been much else to talk about for a long time.
Yeah,
like you guys.
I won't kick the can too much on that one because it might upset a few people. But I guess you mentioned that you knew pretty early on the path you wanted to pursue. Was that always going to be the case? You always wanted to get into footy in some sort of capacity, even if it wasn't ball in hand?
Yeah, and I always liked telling stories and reading stories and watching all the TV shows and listening to the radio. I probably even consumed more then than I do now, if I'm honest. Is sort of so involved in it all now day to day that I don't sort of consume that much beyond what we do at afl.com.au, just because you're in amongst it, and you're not the target audience anyway. In terms of myself, we're not the target audience for the shows and programs out there. It's obviously good to be across so much, but at the time I was everything. I remember the fifth quarter, staying up late to watch the fifth quarter, and before the game on Channel 10, and the grand final replays on the night before the grand final, the marathon of all that, and going to before the game in the grand final episodes, and a few of those in the week off the big game. And footy show. I remember going to the footy show. My dad took me into footy show, met a few of the players, and that was a long time ago when it was at its peak, and Eddie and Sam and Trevor and all those. So it was pretty good times. But I always wanted to do what I'm doing now. I'm very lucky, as I said, that because I knew what I wanted to do, I would sort of narrow it in pretty early on, getting a bit of a head start and getting a foot in the door anywhere that would take me. And luckily enough, a couple of people sort of gave us a chance. And since then, it's been just following the stream really.
Yeah, I guess you say you obviously identified fairly early on what you wanted to do, but did you always have the idea that it was going to be in front of a camera or behind a keyboard or a bit of both? Like, was there a particular dream that you were targeting, or just
Probably
anywhere that was within the space?
There's probably writing, to be honest, at the start, and I think that's still, if any people that come in to do sort of work experience or reach out for some advice, it's always for me that you have to be able to write. It makes it very hard to do a lot of other things in the industry if you can't write some basic stuff from a news point of view or be able to put together that type of thing. So that's where I started, and to be fair, when I sort of got into it, there was TV and radio, but there probably wasn't as much in the online space that was a meld of all those. And now I think most journos have a few different sort of skills in front of the camera or behind the microphone, or a multitude of sort of areas that they want to push or convey what they're seeing and talking about. So that at the time it was probably writing, because that was probably what I thought was the first thing. And I still love the art of, well, not the art, I don't want to sound like it.
No, the art of writing, there's definitely something to be said for that.
Yeah, I mean, I still like sitting down and writing at an interview and writing a news story and the differences that can bring and produce, and the creativity that comes within that as well. I still love going out to a club and speaking to a player, then getting back to the office and sitting down for a little bit in time and thinking, how's the best way to write about this, or how's the best way to sort of push forward what the chat I just had and put it into one story. So that's still a fun part of it for me, but certainly the role in itself for everyone in the game now is pretty wide and varied.
And I guess the journey began pretty successfully. I guess the Clinton Gribus Rising Star, and then obviously you entered the industry in 2012, and I feel like through this entire just a bit over a decade that you've actually been in the space, speaking purely as a consumer of footy content, your name was never too far away from stuff. To your great credit, I feel like, again, purely looking at things as a consumer, like you were there, you were making a splash straight away. And I guess what did it feel like to be actually following through on that dream that you had from such an early age?
I reckon it was even a few years before that. I don't have a LinkedIn page, so you wouldn't have been able to find anything there. But I started sort of doing work experience with the AFL Record and Jeff Slattery Publishing, which at the time was the publisher of the AFL Record and all AFL books, essentially. And that's sort of where I got my start with them. And Michael Lovett and Peter DeSisto there gave me an opportunity to come. I did work experience there when I was in year 10, I think it was, or something like that, year 9 or 10. And some stuff at SEN as well when that was sort of first on the horizon. And it was good because by the time I'd finished uni, I was basically working full time with them. So I think the first grand final I covered from a work point of view was the 2009 grand final, which I know you remember fondly.
I think pretty fondly of,
pretty good game, that one. I remember we did some stuff post game in the rooms, and that was like, wow, like how good's that? I went to the grand final for work.
It's unfortunately the only one that I've missed so far in terms of the successful grand finals. So.
Poor you! You've only been to 3.
I shouldn't speak too much like that. I guess we're getting a bit greedy.
No. I hear you want to be at everything, of course. And it was a good game too.
Yeah,
pretty epic one. But so that was the first work grand final I did. I remember did the draw as well the year after, and was sitting there in the media overflow and thinking, oh my god, like that was bizarre.
You booked your holidays and you had to go again all of a sudden.
I don't think I was booking too many holidays at that point, but I was probably like most people in the media industry going, another week of the grand final build up. As unique as it was a long year, but so that was a pretty cool time to sort of just be starting off. And then AFL Media became its own entity shortly after that, and I sort of got it all together at that point and worked out sort of that's what I wanted to do and bring it all together. So I loved it, and probably from 2012 onwards, that's when I started to really forge ahead with what I wanted to do.
So one of the things that I guess really fascinates me about anyone who's kind of in some form of media, whether it's footy, For anyone who watches and listens to the show, they know I do a lot of video games media stuff, and there's proof of that behind me. But I guess one of the interesting things about being in media, especially in kind of the modern landscape, is there's so many opportunities to interact with players, and you've touched on that yourself. But not just in the professional capacity, but also sometimes in these social ones. So I think about, and I'm pretty sure I saw you there, the AFL 23 event, the launch event for the game earlier this year, and And I guess, there was lots of players there, but it wasn't, there weren't press conferences. There wasn't any of that kind of normal fuss. There wasn't necessarily news that was being chased in that sense. And so there's these opportunities to kind of socialise in ways that aren't necessarily totally geared towards perhaps what's going to be in the papers or on the website or whatever it happens to be. So for yourself personally, what is it like, I guess, fostering the balancing act when it comes to these dialogues and these exchanges with players and clubs and coaches, etc., because there is a line to be walked, I presume, and finding the sweet spot is, I'm sure, a challenge.
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. And to be honest, every single day of working existence is finding that balance, because you hear things and, it's a pretty, as much as people think it's a big industry, it's actually a pretty small industry, man, about the people that are actually in it. And, you don't want to burn too many relationships. You don't want to burn too many people, because in the end, that's going to come back to bite you. And that's a line that I try and tread and walk pretty carefully. In terms of players, I've always been lucky that I've had good relationships with players. That's something I've sort of pride myself on in my gig. But and that a lot of that comes through doing the draft as well, because I get to meet and know a lot of the players before they reach the AFL and get told about all the big bad, nasty elements of the media. And there's realities and perceptions and a mix of all that depending on who you are and what you are. I get all of that, but I do try and foster relationships with the guys coming through, because deep down, I think 99.9% of people in the media are people who've grown up watching footy, loving footy, and wanting to be just a part of the footy, landscape and tell their story, tell the stories of people who are better than them or more educated in the footy space than them, or have more interesting stories. So you're right though, because that night at AFL 23 was just a chance. I thought it was. I mean, obviously our company was at AFL was launching the game,
of course.
So went along and had a little bit of a play with it, but also like I followed Christian Petrarca through his draft year, and got to know him really well through the Going Places series, and he was the first one we did in that series. And so to see him on the front of the cover of that game was like,
it's pretty cool.
How crazy is that? Yeah, it's cool for him. It's cool for the people who get to know him as well. So I'm not saying there's challenges. There's not challenges with it, because there is, because you're also sort of, you're employed to tell the story about what's happening as well from my point of view. But there's no doubt every single day there's that question that you ask around that balance of relationship v what the story is. I think we handle it pretty well though.
There's certainly, as an outsider looking in, I totally feel like that's the case. So what is it like when you do have to report on, I guess, a story that is potentially not going to be received overly well by either a player or, again, some sort of club representative who you potentially have a very good relationship with already? What does that look like when you have to go through that process? Is there a phone call or a message saying, hey, look, and I'm sure there's always the opportunity to comment and those sorts of things too, but I guess what does that conversation have to look like when it's perhaps not the most pleasant conversation you need to have?
Yeah, that's fair. But I think every single week there's an element of that, whether it's 100% of that call, or if it's 20%, or if it's 50%, and there's different ways around that, and there's some to and fro, and that's again where relationships come in. I think that's where respect comes in as well from all parties, where most people respect the job you're doing, and I respect the job most people are doing as well, because everyone's sort of in it for their own people and clubs, or if it's agents for their players, or and livelihoods and players themselves. And so there are those phone calls, but I think there's also some give and take around that as well, which comes into it.
And I guess hopefully those relationships, if they do get tested sometimes with some of those more challenging news pieces, hopefully you're able to then rest upon the strength of those prior to be able to move on and, as you say, build upon that foundation of respect that you've already got.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's a difficulty sometimes, but over time, that's what comes with experience as well, and some trust that if the story is going to be told, it may as well be told in this way. So yeah, but it's a give and take industry. There's no doubt about that. Like most industries, I imagine. Just that I haven't been in any other
Exactly.
industry,
Yeah.
so I don't really know. What's it like at school for you?
Uh, I mean, there's tricky conversations, absolutely. Sometimes with students,
Yeah,
sometimes with the parents, and same with all the games media stuff. And talking developers, they share things, and then all of a sudden you've got to report on them. It's a really tricky sort of space. And so I guess we obviously touched on that the dream was kind of writing, and that is still your one wood is it's the go to, but you have developed this other side in front of the camera and things like the Draft Guru platform, the Phantom Form guides, the Gettable even in more recent years. Obviously, you've built this fantastic reputation as someone who has some amazing insight into what is going on, and you touched on it yourself before with players who are starting to make their way through that draft system, who haven't necessarily been picked up yet, but are on the way. And I guess what does that look like on the day to day because I guess those players don't have the media training yet. I'm sure they're learning it rapidly, but they don't have that same level of media training. They don't have those same experiences. They don't necessarily know what is right and wrong all the time either. So how do you kind of work yourself through that space? Because then obviously you are reporting on these news, you're reporting on these stories, you're talking to club officials who may or may not be showing interest in some of these players as well.
yeah. It's been something that I've sort of grown with over the last decade, really. The first year I started doing some draft, the first draftee I ever wrote about was Brandon Ellis. I remember I went round to his house,
Yeah, right.
and he'd come from a challenging upbringing. He lived at the sort of outside there in Carlton in some commission homes, and was with his family there. And yeah, it was amazing, really, the story. He'd quit footy because his dad had been really sick, and he wanted to be with him. And then his dad had gotten better, and then he'd come back to footy, got drafted in the first round. We know what story he's sort of produced since then. Premiership player at the Tigers, amazing career, really, out of where he came from. So, and from then, I remember speaking to Brandon, and at the time, um, thinking that, geez, this would be a good thing to get involved in because everyone's got a story. Not everyone's going to have a story like this, but every single kid's got a story, and not every single kid's going to have his story told. So why don't I be the one to sort of tell as many as I can? So that was 2011, 2012. I started doing a little bit more. 2012, I sort of spent the whole Vic Metro Carnival inside the Vic Metro team type of thing, and I was just a kid, just sitting around like they were, to be honest, and listening to all the meetings. And in that team was Joe Danaher, Jack Viney,
Some quality players.
Aiden Core. Bottom ages were Josh Kelly, Jack Billings, Luke McDonald, Christian Salem. So like there was Tom Boyd. So there was a stack of guys that come out of that year, but it was starting to get to know that group. And then 2013 was the first year I really started to get going in the draft space, I think, and went to the European trip that year with the AFL Academy, and all of a sudden I was sort of part of that draft machine a little bit. So and loved it. It was a little community in and of itself. It's and that's the recruiting and list management guys, but you only do that through going to games and sort of building up the network through actually going for yourself as well, and getting a sense of. I love going to junior footy. That's probably the part of the weekend I enjoy most. I watch a lot of AFL footy, but I also like going to the junior games a lot as well, just to see who's going well, what's the storyline, who's the name that's no one's written about yet. You just never know what the moment might be that you're at a game. So that's sort of an exciting thing for me to be involved in. But yeah, getting to know the kids, they are, as you say, they're all 18 at draft time or thereabouts. So I think that lends itself to a slightly different take on how you report on these guys. And everyone compares our coverage or AFL coverage of draftees compared to NBA and NFL players. Well, they're a few years older, and I think they're probably a little bit more mature physically, but also emotionally to deal with the criticisms that come with their game. That's not saying that we don't question, bits and pieces of draftees' games and highlight what they're best and worst at, but it is sort of a consideration that I think about all the time on that these kids are 18 dealing with school and things are coming out about them. But yeah, it's I love the draft part of it. It's the most enjoyable thing for me. I've loved doing it over the last decade, and yeah, the Phantom Draft is always a bit of fun right at the end of it, but that's just the last bit of a year's work. And now with Gettable as well, I'm trying to sort of promote the and we've done this across the years, of course, with Road to the Draft as well. But I think Gettable's sort of taken it to a new level as well with the audience that's interested in this draft, and
Yeah.
Harley Reid's been the face of that this year. But also that Harley Reid's faced a challenging year. He couldn't win much this year because he had such a good year the year before. So
Set the bar
that
so
makes for
high.
a whole. Yeah, he did, and that makes sort of it's an interesting element to how the draft coverage has grown over the past decade. And when we started doing the Phantom Form Guide, and this isn't to beat our chest, but like this
No,
just
please.
shows I think the growth in the coverage, and I love it because there wasn't monthly rankings from anyone. That's when we started the Phantom Form Guide, thinking that's a good thing to add to the sort of draft landscape, and now they're everywhere, and I love that because it shows that people are interested and involved. And I think most people at the end of the year will know 30 names of a draft, whereas maybe 20 years ago they knew Hodge, Ball, Judd.
Yeah, it was always kind of that top half a dozen or so, perhaps at best, and then beyond that, everyone kind of felt like a bit of a no-name unless there was a father-son later in the pick or whatever the case might happen to be. But these days the level of education that the standard consumer of footy has is so much greater thanks to platforms like the ones that you've created and been a part of, and obviously everyone else who's kind of looked to either emulate or forge their own paths as well. Now, obviously,
I mean, there's different ideas. There's different ideas, and that's been great about it as well. I think that people have recognised the interest in it, and we're seeing different things pop up.
You obviously mentioned Harley Reid there, and I'd love to pick your brain about some of the more present day stuff as we start kind of running low on time to chat today. Harley Reid, how are you feeling as an observer of this and someone who speaks to a lot of different parties involved? How are you feeling about this current situation? We're hearing rumblings about is he not saying yes or no to travel to WA to join the Eagles. There's obviously conversations about teams trying to position themselves with draft picks and trades to potentially offer that to West Coast and try and take pick one. I guess what's your feel of the situation as things stand?
I've got to know Harley really well this year, and he was on the show earlier this year, and that's probably what started a little bit this trend around his discussion around, I think we asked him how would you fare moving. He said he's a family-oriented person, and he is, but he's also a determined person, and a pretty laid-back person as well. He's got that nice blend of, the fierce desire to be really, really good, but also a laid-back sort of personality beyond that. And I think that's been good for him over the last however long, because if he wasn't laid back, it would have been a very stressful year for him to wake up every day and know that there's going to be something said about him when he's still at school in Tongala. So, yeah, he's not saying no at all, and he hasn't actually spoken to West Coast, I think, since December or January at the start of the year. So,
yeah, right.
Look, he'll go where he's up for. Now, it's up to other clubs if they want to try and trade up to get him because they think he's more comfortable staying in Victoria. He's going to have to move regardless. There's no footy club at Tongala. Not one playing AFL footy anyway. So he's going to have to do that, and he knows that. He's comfortable with where the situation sits. And like any kid, it's not necessarily the moving that is the challenging thought. It's the uncertainty of it all. And that's the uncertainty of anyone. He's lucky in that he knows he's going to get drafted. There's uncertain players, pick 40, 50 onwards who aren't sure they're actually going to be picked. But the uncertainty of what happens and waiting for that moment in 4 months' time is a difficulty. So, look, he'll be fine. He'll be fine wherever he goes. And it's not going to stop clubs from coming for that pick at the top of the draft. And West Coast will consider it, and they'll either keep it and pick him, I think, or they'll trade it and get multiple picks and end up – they can't really lose. So,
there's a king's ransom possible.
Exactly right. He's in a good spot, and he'll be a great player for wherever he goes.
Now, we are a Geelong show, and so I'd love to kind of pick your brain a little bit on some more Geelong-specific things. Now, obviously, again, you're a student of the draft and those coming through. What are you seeing when it comes to the Falcons, the footy factory as is so often referred to? What are you seeing coming out of the Geelong region at the moment?
Well, I do like Tom Anastasopoulos, which is a mouthful to get out, but he's had a pretty good season. Yeah. He needs to just be. It's almost like shorten it up a little bit. Anna, maybe, whatever it is. But he's impressed this year. I think he's been someone who, towards the start of the season, probably we weren't sure about is he going to be big enough. He had some moments throughout the carnival for Vic Country, but I feel like he's done his chances no harm. He's got that good speed, endurance mix. So I like him as a prospect. We've seen a little bit of Hasty as well, Angus Hasty, who's a midfielder.
Yep.
A good clearance getter as well. So he's one. I think Michael Rudd, who I nearly call Paul every time I actually call his name.
I
Maybe
can see
that's
that.
the Friends fan in me. When I'm a Friends fan more than probably a bit of other Paul Rudd material. But yeah, he had a good carnival. I think he put his name up there to be in the mix as a key forward. He's probably going to be that sort of third tall option for
Yep.
clubs. I think who if he does get taken at the next level. So he's one who I think really pushed himself up through the national champs, and Joe Pike as well. Obviously, the big fellow in the ruck who we know about. Patrick Hughes has been a midfield option. I think that clubs have really sort of looked at and assessed over the course of the season. Been in pretty good form. Was good a couple of weeks ago against Tassie, I think it was. So yeah, at 25, so, he's a consistent player. It's going to be interesting to see where he fits in. That's necessarily given there's probably not a huge amount of midfielders right at the very top end. Then you'd
Yep.
probably get to a bit of a glut of them 25 onwards. So if he fits somewhere in there potentially, but they're probably the group at the moment. I don't think I've missed anyone. I might have, but they're probably amongst the better chances for the Falcons.
No, that's fantastic insight. Something we always appreciate, especially as Geelong fans, where we're hopeful that even if we don't pick
Well,
them
you
up,
probably
hopefully
draft
they'll come back.
half of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and the ones that we don't because they get scooped early, we'll try and bring them back in a few years' time.
Exactly.
So, I guess we've touched on the drafting side, but obviously you've got the ear to the ground when it comes to the trade scene and a lot of other movement as well. And again, that kind of links to things like Gettable. So Asava Radaglia has been a name that's come up fairly frequently, certainly in the last 12 months or so, with Port showing interest previously, and other clubs have kind of dipped the toes in too. Geelong keeps digging the heels in. Chris Scott, in particular, has been very vocal about the fact that, I mean, for years that he loves Asava, but also that he really would like him to stay. What's your gut feel as you kind of analyse that scene at the moment?
Gut feel is that he's going to be pretty gettable without wanting to name drop our show, but yeah, I mean, he's out of contract this time around. He was obviously up for grabs last year from his own mind. He put his hand up to go to Port Adelaide. Pick 33 wasn't enough. Fair enough. He's in contract. There was some doubts on Tomahawk's foot at that point as well, so they probably didn't want to move on a key position player like that without that certainty around when he would be available in Hawkins. So yeah, I can understand why they kept him. This year, he's worth more from a trade front because he's played better at particularly the first half of the season, but he's out of contract. So it's an interesting dynamic.
It balances out.
Yeah, it does a little bit. And the other part of it is from a Geelong perspective, there are multiple takers. So we've spoken about Port Adelaide throughout the year. That clearly they'll have the interest again. I think we spoke about on Gettable last week of Hawthorn having a watch as well on Radaglia Chase. So I think it's hard to see him if he's not going to be playing in the team. It's hard to see him staying. I think that's probably the natural conclusion a lot of clubs will be making at the moment. Given he's probably fallen now to fourth in line, Geelong lineup probably even better than most. But yeah, fourth in line in that key defensive stock since we've seen Jack Henry come back and play some good footy. So yeah, I think that's probably where it sits. Yeah, it's going to be hard, and it's a harder sell to stay, isn't it? I'm sure Geelong want him to stay. And Chris Scott's spoken about that on a couple of different occasions, but it's a harder sell to stay when you're out of the side.
On the flip side, the club has obviously been well noted, and we touched on this in terms of players coming back to Geelong and those sorts of things. We've obviously been quite noted in recent years in terms of the way that we can potentially draw players from other clubs, either returning home or just because the area is obviously it's got its perks. In terms of players that the club might be targeting, is there anything that you're seeing, hearing, have a bit of a feel for?
I still think the midfield is the spot where you look at even on the weekend. There's some. Yeah, I love Tanner Bruin as a player. I think he's going to be a jet. I think we've seen signs of that already. I think it's also worth remembering that he's in year 3 of a career. So I think we've seen enough to know that he's going to be a gun, and he's played some great games this year. But there's also experience that comes with just more and more games. So I think that's where you look at it and think, Dangerfield's getting to the latter stage of his career. Selwood goes. Duncan, of course, isn't in the square as much, but there's that role. And Jai Clark, Cam Guthrie as well, who's 30 odd now or so. So, and Jai Clark's going to get there. I'm a big fan of Jai as well and love his mix of grunt and class, but he's still young. So I think that's where the Darcy Parish interest would lie. And there's obviously, as a free agent, that's even more appealing. But he's spoken about staying at the Bombers as well. But contract negotiations have been ongoing there. So until you sign, you're unsigned, and
exactly
that's still there. But I think that midfield role is where I'd be looking at for sure.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and absolutely, yeah, you're unsigned, and that it just allows those conversations to continue. So who knows what's possible in that particular space. We're almost out of time, so we'll look to wrap things up here, and I'd love to get your perspective on this one. It's a question that I ask anyone who comes on the show, but as someone who kind of spends a lot of time assessing the draft and trades and those sort of things, I tend to ask, and again, Geelong-centric show, if you had the opportunity, you're building your team, and you've got Gary Jr. and Gary Sr. standing before you, which way are you going to go?
I'll go with Ollie Dempsey.
Sorry, Ollie, that's not meant to be like a crack at you, of course.
No, it's not. I'm a big Ollie Dempsey fan,
So
by the way.
am I,
I was actually at the game where I think Geelong scouts saw him for the first time, watching Carey, and I wanted to get an Ollie Dempsey mention in because I'm a big Ollie Dempsey fan.
Good.
Going back to your question, look, I'm probably not old enough to have seen Gary Senior at his absolute zenith, so it's probably Gary Junior. But Collingwood has Gary Jr. at the moment in number 35's jumper, so we're getting a second. But we're getting a second birth of greatness through.
There is
through
something
that
special over there.
I like goals. I generally sort of am someone who's pretty fond of goal kickers, so I'll go with Gary Senior. But it's marginal. It's very marginal.
Yeah, you're not going to go wrong either way.
Who'd you pick?
No, I don't think anyone's asked me. I've been pretty comfortable just throwing that question at people. And
I'm the journo here. Yeah.
But I think I'd probably actually go the same way as you. I do obviously have a fondness for goals being kicked, and I think it's no offense to Gary Jr., but there's a lot more top tier midfielders out there that if you get Gary Senior, then you've got a gigantic pool of still equally capable or nearly equally capable midfielders available. Whereas the pool thins very quickly when it comes to the gun forwards. So
yeah,
I think that kind of, if there's a strategic edge to the whole thing, it probably makes me steer towards Gary Senior. Cal, it's been fantastic to have you on the show and to learn about this journey so far, to get some fascinating insights into the scene. It's been awesome to chat. If people want to, and we've obviously plugged several of the shows and the platform so far, but if people do want to see more of what you're up to, where should people go?
Go to afl.com.au every Wednesday. Gettable. It's our fun show that we're doing this year, and having a lot of enjoyment in putting it together. So hopefully we'll have Andrew Mackey on there soon enough as well from a Cats perspective. We're going through a fair few clubs at the moment, so we'll have him on to talk about what's ahead and what's in store for the Cats. So appreciate the time, Paul. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it. It's been awesome to chat and to pick the brains of someone who's been doing such an amazing job in this space. So if people aren't already checking out all of Kel's stuff on afl.com.au, they absolutely should. It's a fascinating read. It's a fascinating view and a listen. So please make sure to go check that out. As I said, Kel, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks, Mark. Cats fans, as always, remain Geelong strong, and I'll see you next week.